Contextual inquiry has its origin in the 1990s when Hugh Beyer and Karen Holtzblatt first wrote about the process. And the main text on contextual inquiry is Holtzblatt's 2005 book on the subject. Here's a picture of that book, Rapid Contextual Design, which includes contextual inquiry as part of a larger design life cycle. The focus of that book is work. So it's not about discretionary computing. It was written in 2005, a time when desktop applications in the workplace were being emphasized. But it is a robust process, and it is useful for more contemporary computing activities like discretionary computing. And it was intended to be for radical change. So this could be radical redesign of existing applications or new applications from the ground up to support existing work or even play processes. In fact, any time that I say work in this presentation, you could substitute the word play because this is suitable for discretionary or non-discretionary purposes. It depends, contextual inquiry depends on familiar work structure. And this has very important consequences. So you don't want to use contextual inquiry for work structures with which the designer is completely unfamiliar. They should be structures, work or play structures that are easy to understand. And as I say, these have important consequences. And the main consequence is that minimal client time is required because you, the designer, already understand something about what the client is doing. And you, the designer, can skip the artifacts that describe the existing design because you have a solid understanding of what the existing design is. And so this saves the designer time. And because it saves the designer time, it's inexpensive. And because it's inexpensive, it's popular. And that's why I'm talking about it now. But there are alternatives. And I would like to talk about a couple of those alternatives just to give you an idea of some of the salient points about contextual inquiry and how it contrasts with other approaches. And there are many other approaches. I'm just going to talk about two. The first one is participatory design. So participatory design makes the user a full partner in the entire design process. And that is done to empower users. That's the purpose of participatory design, is to empower the users, making them full partners. It's for user acceptance. And so it's often employed when users are resistant to change, which very often happens. And it's works best for incremental changes for the same reason. And it takes up lots and lots of client time. So those are some of the salient points that distinguish participatory design from contextual inquiry. The other approach that I would like to talk about briefly is ethnography. Ethnography needs considerable time. Ethnography needs considerable time from both the client and the designer. And ethnography is a process that's used for exotic work practices. So let me explain what I mean by the word exotic. Exotic work practices are best typified by an example. So this is a particularly famous example, as a matter of fact, technology adoption by radiologists. So the work of radiologists is exotic by any measure. Few people outside radiology understand the work that radiologists do. Certainly as a designer, you shouldn't be able to understand what radiologists do. This qualifies as an exotic work practice. As a matter of fact, in this very famous study of technology adoption by radiologists, Stephen Barley, who was a professor at Stanford, actually studied for and received a medical degree during his 7-year ethnography of radiologists. And that may seem like a very extreme example, but I assure you that ethnographers embed themselves very deeply in the work or play of the subjects of their study. Okay, so let me summarize these choices, what the salient points that I want you to keep in mind about these choices, and there are 3 of them. The first is designer time. So the designer time is the most in ethnography and the least in contextual inquiry. The amount of client time is the most in participatory design and the least in contextual inquiry. And the degree of change that the new digital artifact represents over the old digital artifact or the non-digital manual process is the most in ethnography and in contextual inquiry, and the least in participatory design. So that's pretty much all I want to say about the alternatives to contextual inquiry. Now I'd like to talk about the process of contextual inquiry. And that process is in basically three parts. And the three parts are interviews, an interpretation session that in which you understand the individual points that have come up during the interviews, and an affinity diagramming process in which you structure your understanding of the individual points that have come up in the interviews. And these second and third steps, interpretation session and affinity diagramming, typically happen together in one huge marathon session. Okay, so the first step is the interview. So you have an interview, but a very particular kind of interview with the users. And in this case, the interviewer has some control, but not complete control. In the case of contextual inquiry, I'm saying. So we can imagine a continuum or a spectrum from an across-the-table interview at one end of the spectrum to observation, such as an ethnographer engages in, at the other end of the spectrum. And contextual inquiry is sort of in between. It's not completely controlled by the designer, and it's not completely controlled by the end user. It's influenced by both. And the interview takes place in the workplace or the play place, as the case may be. And here's an example of a contextual inquiry interviewer on the left taking notes, and the user on the right is interacting with some technology in the workplace. And the interviewer studies the processes that the user is engaged in. And here's another example, the interviewer on the left taking notes, the user on the right engaging with an automated panel for shopping cart processes. The interviewer notes both what the user says in the interview and what the user does with the technology. And so I personally think, this is not something you're going to get out of the Holtzblatt book, but my opinion, Holtzblatt says that you should have one interviewer and one user. My opinion, in contrast, is that you should have two interviewers and one user. One of the interviewers should be engaged with the user and talking with the user, watching what the user is doing with the computer. The other interviewer should be acting as a scribe and a controller. And in the scribe position, they're just taking notes. They're the only one of the interviewers taking notes. The other interviewer doesn't take any notes. The scribe takes notes. And the scribe also, because the scribe is looking at the notes, is in a position to put the other interviewer back on track if the interviewer who's engaged wanders off track, or if the other interviewer forgets an important point. But the scribe says very little during the entire process. And this is partly because the interviewer watches the user interaction with the computer. And if you try to watch somebody's interaction with the computer, you're not in a very good position to take notes. In fact, what you're in a good position to do is to say what it is that you see, and then someone else can take those notes. And you may write notes directly on post-it notes, as you can see in the example here. These people are working with artifacts on the table, and it's likely that you probably won't use post-it notes in the interview. You'll probably create post-it notes later. And you'll probably create them either on a poster board, like this is a 36 by 48 inch typical poster board that you find in office supply stores or art supply stores, or that you will do it on a whiteboard or just on a wall or on a big sheet of art paper. Anyway, after the interview, there's a really important point to keep in mind. Don't discuss the interviews after the interviews before the interpretation session. The first time that you talk about the interviews, you're likely to do a brain dump, and you're likely to lose information. So you don't want to do that until you're in a position to record that information. So it may seem counterintuitive, but you really need to wait until the interpretation session to discuss the interviews. And the interpretation session should happen within 48 hours after the interviews. So the interviews should be really bunched together if you possibly can, not spaced out over a couple of weeks or something like that, because you'll forget what went on in the interviews for certain. They should be bunched together and followed within 48 hours by an interpretation session. So the interpretation session is a single activity. All that we do in the interpretation session is create affinity notes from the interview notes. And each of these affinity notes is a single post-it note. Each of these affinity notes contains one atom of information. Each affinity note is written in the first person as if the user said it. So each affinity note represents the voice of the user. And the user says one thing per affinity note. Okay? Then you're going to have a huge pile of affinity notes. I almost said huge. Oops. So now you're ready to go on to affinity diagramming. And the affinity diagramming process is a little bit more complicated. And there are many styles of affinity diagramming, by the way. In fact, I image Googled and look at the variety of affinity diagrams that I see. They do all have one thing in common, though. Or almost all of them have one thing in common, which is that they are organized columns of small atomic notes. And anyway, here's Holtzblatt's method for doing affinity diagramming. So the goal of the affinity diagramming process is to group and label the affinity notes. We want to group them in a way, and we want to label them. And there are 6 steps to achieving this goal. And I'm just going to read off the 6 steps to you here, and then I'm going to go one at a time through the 6 steps in detail. First, we add 500 affinity notes to the wall, or the whiteboard, or the poster board, whatever it is. Second, we add a bottom level of labels. Third, we add a temporary top level set of labels, and then we reorganize all the affinity notes and all the bottom level of labels to match the temporary top level labels. And then that's not going to work out very well, so what we'll do as the 4th step is remove the temporary top level labels, and we'll add a set of middle level labels, and then finally we'll add a new set of final top level labels. Okay, so let's look at each one of these steps. The first step is to add 500 notes to the wall, as I say, or whiteboard or poster board or whatever, and cluster them. And we cluster them by similarity. And I say 500 just to emphasize that there should be a lot. But if you have few notes, this entire process is a complete waste of time. You probably need more and better interviews if you have few notes. And you can't get you can't get lots of notes without practice. You can't do well with interviewing without practicing. You have to practice to acquire skill. The only way to acquire skill, both at interviewing and note-taking, is to practice. So you may even want to do practice interviews before your real interviews, so that you're already have a little bit of practice and skill under your belt before you go on to your first real interview. Because interviews are precious. Client time is precious. So the second step is to add bottom level labels. So what's going to happen as you're doing the first step is that the mass of affinity notes is going to become unmanageably large. And when it becomes so large that you can't keep track of what is where, that's when you start adding bottom level labels. And here's an example where there are some clusters of affinity notes, and some bottom level labels have been added. And these bottom level labels are uniform in color. And the bottom level label's color differs from the affinity note color. And eventually, after you've put up all the affinity notes and all the bottom, and you've labeled them all with bottom level labels, you're going to arrange them into columns of affinity notes with bottom level labels above them. Now you have a lot of categories now. There will be a lot of bottom level labels. And so now you're ready to add temporary top level labels. And these summarize the bottom level labels so that there are fewer top level labels than bottom level labels. Many fewer top level labels than bottom level labels. They are a summary. And they are yet a different color than the bottom level labels. And you reorganize the bottom level labels and the affinity notes to match these top level labels. And you're going to find that that's not going to work out too well. And perhaps your wall will begin to look like this. And so what you're going to eventually do is remove those top level labels, because you'll notice that patterns have developed that don't quite fit these top-level labels. That's part of the process of coming to understand what's going on with the affinity notes. So it's not a mistake or anything. It's part of the process is to now remove the top-level labels and instead put a middle level of labels. We call this a middle level of labels because it's finer grained than the original top level labels. Your original top level labels probably were very few. You had very few categories to fit everything into, but it's the more you look at the affinity notes and the bottom level labels, the more difficult it is to rationalize a very small number of categories. So you're going to put in a larger number of categories with these middle level labels. And then just using the middle level labels, you'll be ready to decide on final top level labels that actually do summarize the middle level labels. And this is the final result of the contextual inquiry process, or these columns of top level labels with middle level and bottom level labels and affinity notes beneath them. And in the workplace, the entire interpretation session and affinity diagramming process could take a full 8-hour workday, or in fact should take a full 8-hour workday. Now, this is an illustration from the original paper by Beyer and Holtzblatt. I've never, in a classroom situation, had anything that was even half the size of this, but I want you to understand what you're aiming for in the workplace is a very detailed, very rich understanding of the context of work, or, as I say, of play. So now, what are the products of contextual inquiry? So after contextual inquiry, it's very likely that you'll move on to creating personas and scenarios. And these personas and scenarios are informed by the affinity diagram. So personas and scenarios are a completely separate topic. I don't mean to preach to you about personas and scenarios here, but here's an example of a persona, and all of the characteristics of the persona should come from the affinity diagram. And in particular, everything here should be congruent with that top level of labels on the affinity diagram. And any time that something is ambiguous or that there is a seeming contradiction, you should resolve it by going to the appropriate top level label and drilling down to the middle level labels, the bottom level labels, and the affinity notes to find out what it is that can illuminate the ambiguity or resolve the contradiction. Okay, and so that's the end of this presentation. I do urge you to read. This is just an overview, a brief overview of the process. I do urge you to read Holtzblatt's book on the process to get a more complete picture. But anyway, for this presentation, I'm Mick McQuaid, and I thank you very much for your attention.